In 2024, at JFK Airport, a determined flight attendant dreams of becoming a pilot, breaking barriers of race and gender in aviation. Layla Karim's journey begins with skepticism from a mysterious billionaire who questions her resolve. Can she overcome the odds and redefine the skies? New York, April 2024. Outside, massive planes sat still on the tarmac, their polished fuselages glinting faintly in the early morning light. From the terminal, Layla Karim could see each aircraft preparing for its next journey. Inside JFK Airport, travelers rolled their suitcases across the gleaming tiled floor, their hurried footsteps echoing the relentless pace of the city. The electronic display boards flickered incessantly. Flight to Los Angeles, Gate 18. Flight to Atlanta, Gate 24. Layla moved briskly through the terminal, dressed in the navy blue uniform of Blue Sky Airlines. One hand pulled a small suitcase while the other clutched her handbag tightly. A silk scarf tied around her neck fluttered slightly as she walked. Despite the polite smile she offered to every passerby, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Every time she passed through this airport, a familiar thought lingered. Here she was, still working as a flight attendant. But one day, her gaze drifted to the planes outside the window, her eyes gleaming with determination. One day, she would sit in the cockpit and fly them herself. That thought burned quietly within her, a persistent ember that flared to life each time she walked past the doors leading to the cockpit, doors that always remained closed to her. In the crew lounge, a few attendants were chatting animatedly. Layla sat alone in a corner, flipping through a well-worn flight operations manual she had read countless times. The book was thick, filled with formulas and procedures for operating an aircraft. Running her fingers along the printed lines, she silently vowed to memorize every detail, knowing it was the key to making her dream a reality. The door swung open. Ethan, a tall, confident male attendant, strode in. He glanced at the manual in Layla's hands and smirked. "You're reading that again?" His tone was laced with mockery. "Still dreaming of becoming a pilot?" Layla looked up, her smile polite but unwavering. "Yes." Ethan shrugged. "Good luck with that." He walked away but threw a parting remark over his shoulder, just saying, "This field isn't made for people like you. People like me?" Layla clenched her jaw but kept her composure. She had heard it before. People like her, a black woman from the Bronx, someone no one believed could ever sit in the cockpit. Closing the manual, she stood and walked to the lounge's large window. Outside, a plane ascended gracefully into the vast blue sky. Let them say whatever they want, she thought. I'm not stopping. One day, I'll be in that cockpit, and I will fly. Layla Karim had grown up in the Bronx, a neighborhood teeming with immigrant families and relentless hustle. Her parents, immigrants from Ghana, had always believed that hard work could secure a brighter future for their children in America. But Layla had quickly learned that reality was rarely so simple. As a child, she would often stand by the small window of their cramped apartment, watching planes streak across the sky. She always wondered who's flying them. When she shared her dream of becoming a pilot, the adults around her would laugh it off. "Girls don't need to fly planes, Layla. Be practical." Even her mother, Aisha Karim, a strict but loving woman, urged her to choose a safer path. "You've already got a good job, Layla. Being a flight attendant is something to be proud of. Don't chase after impossible things." Though times had changed, aviation in 2024 remained a male-dominated industry. Women made up only 5% of commercial pilots, and among them, black women were nearly invisible. Layla knew these statistics well. She also knew that to become a pilot, she would have to overcome not only grueling exams, but also the persistent biases surrounding her race and gender. During her shifts at the airport, she often felt the weight of skeptical gazes from colleagues as she carried her flight manual. "Do you really think you could be a pilot?" Another attendant had once asked bluntly, her tone dripping with doubt. "They don't understand me," Layla thought. Instead of responding, she simply smiled and returned to her studies. But their words lingered, a bitter reminder of the uphill battle she faced. Walking to the massive window overlooking the tarmac, Layla watched the planes resting silently in the morning light. Her resolve hardened. They can doubt me all they want. I'll prove them wrong. Deep down, Layla knew one truth. She belonged in the cockpit. Layla stepped out of the crew lounge and merged into the flow of passengers making their way toward the boarding gates. The small suitcase she pulled behind her rolled steadily on the polished floors, its rhythmic hum blending with the lively sounds of JFK Airport. Her flight today was bound for Los Angeles, a journey spanning more than 6 hours. Layla had always cherished these cross-country flights. They gave her moments to gaze at the vast expanse of the sky, quietly nurturing her dream of sitting in the cockpit, gripping the controls, and guiding a massive aircraft through the clouds. But today, there was a strange feeling in her chest, a sense that this flight might change something. As Layla walked through the first-class cabin, she greeted the seated passengers with a polite smile. Business suits, gleaming watches, and confident gazes spoke of a world of privilege and ease. She passed by each row until her eyes landed on an older man seated in the farthest corner. Jack Barlow. Layla hesitated briefly. This man was unlike the others. He wasn't engrossed in his phone or laptop, nor did he exude the urgency of someone heading to an important meeting. He simply sat there, his piercing eyes fixed on the window as though lost in some distant memory. Jack's silver hair was cropped neatly, his suit understated yet elegant. His demeanor radiated the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to control, but his gaze betrayed a profound sadness, a heaviness that seemed to linger. Layla couldn't help but feel there was something unusual about this man. Once the flight leveled off at cruising altitude, Layla made her way to the first-class cabin for her routine checks. As she passed by Jack Barlow, she stopped. "Sir, is there anything I can get you?" Jack turned slowly, his cold, steely eyes meeting hers for a few moments before he shook his head. "No, thank you." Layla nodded and began to move on, but a sudden thought struck her. "Forgive me," she said softly, "but you seem familiar with the skies, don't you?" Jack arched an eyebrow, mildly intrigued. "And what makes you think that?" Layla hesitated, choosing her words carefully. There was something in the way he sat, the way he gazed out the window. It reminded her of someone who had spent their life commanding the heavens. "Just a feeling," she replied with a small smile. Jack chuckled faintly, though it was devoid of warmth. "I used to be a pilot, but that was a long time ago." Layla hadn't expected her instinct to be correct, let alone to discover she was speaking to Jack Barlow, a name once renowned in aviation and technology. Jack had been a celebrated military pilot, amassing countless hours in high-stakes missions. After retiring from the Air Force, he had founded a tech company, swiftly becoming a billionaire through innovations in artificial intelligence and aviation navigation systems. But his world came crashing down after a family tragedy. A plane crash had claimed the lives of his loved ones, and from that moment, Jack withdrew from aviation, retreating from the spotlight of the industry he had once dominated. As the flight continued, Jack began to sense that Layla wasn't just an ordinary flight attendant. When she passed by again, he spoke first. "How long have you been doing this?" 6 years, Layla replied. Jack nodded thoughtfully. 6 years as a flight attendant. "So, what's next for you?" Layla offered a small smile. "I want to be a pilot." Jack's brow furrowed slightly, though his expression betrayed no real surprise. Instead, he studied her intently, as if weighing something unseen. "You realize this industry isn't built for people like you," Jack said, his voice low and deliberate. Layla caught the meaning behind his words. There was no malice, only a sober acknowledgement of the barriers she would face. Yet her response was steady, her voice unwavering. "I don't believe in limits set by others." Jack leaned back, his sharp gaze never leaving her. For a moment, he simply observed her in silence. "Well then," he said finally, "I'll be watching to see what you can do." Layla inclined her head in acknowledgement and moved on. But even as she exited the first-class cabin, she could feel Jack's eyes following her, a gaze that carried the weight of understanding. The encounter lingered with Layla, stirring something deep within her. Jack Barlow isn't just any passenger, she thought. He knows the sky better than anyone, and maybe Just maybe he'll be the one to help me reach it. Layla relentlessly pursued her dream. She spent every free moment scouring the country for pilot training programs, sending applications from New York to Texas, from major commercial academies to smaller flight schools. But the responses were always the same. Opening the latest envelope, Layla's eyes scanned the now familiar bolded text at the top of the letter. Thank you for your interest in our training program. Unfortunately, we cannot accept your application at this time. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath before folding the letter neatly. Layla thought bitterly. The same cold, dismissive words as always. She opened the drawer of her desk and placed the letter on a growing stack of rejection notices. Dozens of them were piled there, each a stark reminder of the uphill battle she was fighting. But this time, Layla didn't feel the sharp sting of disappointment. Instead, a wry smile crossed her face as she murmured, "Someday, they'll have no choice but to say yes." Layla continued her work as a flight attendant for Blue Sky Airlines. Despite the repeated rejections, she refused to give up. Every time she stepped into the airplane cabin, her eyes lingered on the cockpit door. During a flight to Chicago, as part of her pre-takeoff routine, Layla walked past the cockpit to inspect the cabin. Inside, the two pilots sat comfortably, chatting casually about the journey ahead. They didn't notice Layla standing there. To them, she was just a flight attendant, someone who brought coffee and served meals. Layla paused for a moment at the cockpit door, her gaze fixed on the intricate control panel where the captain's hands rested lightly on the throttle. She thought to herself, "One day I'll sit there. I won't just bring them coffee. I'll be the one flying the plane." But no matter how fiercely she clung to her dream, there were moments when frustration crept into her thoughts. During a conversation with her closest colleague, Emily Sanders, Layla let out a weary sigh. "Emily, I've sent over 20 applications. They all turned me down." Emily's expression softened with understanding. "Layla, it's not because you're not qualified. They're rejecting you because you're a woman, and a woman of color." Layla bit her lip, swallowing the sting of those words. She knew Emily was right, but the truth didn't diminish her resolve. "I won't give up." Layla met Emily's gaze, her eyes burning with determination. "One day, I'll be in that cockpit, and they won't be able to ignore me forever." As Layla walked through the passenger cabin for a final pre-takeoff check, her calm demeanor belied the storm of thoughts in her mind. Her eyes swept over the rows of passengers, but her focus was elsewhere. "Let them reject me as many times as they want," she thought. "I won't stop. The sky belongs to everyone, and I'll prove that I deserve to be there." Passing the cockpit door once more, she watched it close behind her. But in her heart, she felt another door opening, a door to the vast sky she had dreamed of conquering for so long. That challenging journey took an unexpected turn when Layla encountered Jack Barlow again, the enigmatic man she had served on a flight to Los Angeles. This time, Jack would not merely observe her from the shadows. He would take on a pivotal role in her journey. Jack Barlow, the man who had once ruled the skies, would become her mentor, guiding her through the turbulence ahead. What Layla couldn't know was that this reunion would alter the course of her life forever. After countless rejection letters, Layla decided she wouldn't submit another online application. She wanted to confront those who could grant her a chance, face to face. The flight to Texas carried her renewed hope. Gazing out the airplane window, Layla saw the endless stretch of blue sky and silently resolved, "I'll convince them. This is my dream, and I won't give up." Layla stepped into Lone Star Pilot Training Center, one of the most prestigious aviation academies in the southern United States. The air was thick with formality, and the conservative atmosphere was unmistakable. The director of admissions office was at the end of a long corridor with white walls and cold-tiled floors. A brass plaque on the door read, "James Whitaker, Director of Admissions." Layla drew a deep breath before knocking. "Come in," a low, gravelly voice called from inside. She opened the door and entered. The office was modest, but commanded an air of authority. Framed photos of graduates lined the walls, each a solemn face, each a white man. Not one bore any resemblance to her. Behind the desk sat James Whitaker, his posture rigid, clad in a gray suit, with neatly combed silver hair. He removed his glasses, surveying Layla from head to toe, his gaze sharp, appraising. "You're Layla Karim?" His voice was steady, detached. "Yes, sir," Layla replied, her tone calm yet confident. "Take a seat." Layla sat opposite him, feeling the weight of his scrutiny with every move she made. Whitaker picked up her file, flipping through a few pages before stopping at her resume. "You have experience as a flight attendant?" "Yes, sir. I've been with Blue Sky Airlines for 6 years." Whitaker lifted his eyes to meet hers. "So, why do you want to become a pilot?" Layla took a deep breath. She knew this question was her moment to speak her truth. "Because it's my dream. I don't just want to serve passengers. I want to fly the plane, to take it to the skies." Whitaker leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "This industry isn't easy. You understand that?" "Yes, sir. I do." "And do you think you're fit for it?" His voice was cool, his question pointed. "We need people who can handle pressure." Layla lifted her chin, her eyes unwavering. "I'm a woman of color who grew up in the Bronx," she said, her voice steady, deliberate. "I've handled pressure my whole life." Whitaker's expression flickered, just for a moment. He stared at her, as though reassessing. There was a faint glimmer of surprise, even respect, in his eyes. But he said nothing more. Instead, he closed her file and set it aside. "We'll review your application," he said, his tone still distant. "Thank you for coming in." Layla stood, extending her hand for a handshake. "Thank you for your time." Whitaker shook her hand briefly. His grip was cold, the gesture brisk. As Layla walked out of the office, her heart pounded. She knew the interview offered no clear outcome. But as she glanced back at the photos on the wall, faces so unlike her own, Layla thought, "One day, my photo will be there, and it will be the start of something bigger for others like me." Layla stepped out of the center, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. The Texas sky stretched wide and blue above her, waiting for those bold enough to dream and fight for it. Though the interview ended without resolution, Layla didn't give up. She kept searching for opportunities. Then, an unexpected phone call from Jack Barlow, the mysterious man she'd met on her flight, promised to change everything. "Layla Karim?" His voice rang clear through the line. "I have an offer for you. Are you willing to come back to Texas?" Layla froze for a second, but only for a second. Then she smiled. "Yes, Mr. Barlow. I'm ready." The interview in Texas had ended, but the results remained unclear. Layla returned to the Bronx with a heavy heart. On the subway ride home, she gazed out the window, watching high-rises and impoverished neighborhoods blur past in the fiery glow of the sunset. "I won't stop," she thought. But she knew there was another challenge waiting for her at home: her mother. The Karim family small apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building. The peeling paint on the walls and the dim, yellow light from the overhead bulb gave the place a sense of warmth, but also bore the marks of time and struggle. Layla stepped inside and found her mother, Aisha Karim, sitting in the kitchen. The tiny kitchen, with its worn wooden table marked by years of scratches, carried the faint aroma of watered-down coffee. The silence was so thick it felt stifling. Aisha set her coffee cup down, her worried eyes meeting Layla's. "You're home," she said gently, though a tension beneath her voice betrayed her unease. Layla pulled out a chair and sat across from her. The air between them felt taut, like a string stretched too tightly, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Aisha spoke first, unable to hold back any longer. "Layla, did you go to Texas again to apply?" Layla nodded. "Yes, Mama." Aisha sighed, resting her hands on the table. "Layla, you should know your place in this society. You already have a good job. Being a flight attendant is something this family can be proud of. What more do you want?" Layla clasped her hands tightly beneath the table, her gaze dropping to the coffee cup in front of her. "Mama, I don't want to just serve coffee on a plane. I want to fly it. I want to be a pilot." Aisha shook her head, her eyes filled with both sadness and firmness. "Do you think they'll let you do that?" "Layla, you're a woman. You're a woman of color. They won't accept you." Layla looked up, her eyes shining with determination. "Mama, if everyone thinks that way, we'll never move forward. Someone has to break the barriers. But Aisha remained steadfast. Layla, I don't want you to be disappointed. I don't want you to lose everything over a dream that isn't realistic. Layla lowered her head, her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The anger she had suppressed for so long began to rise. You think I don't know what I'm up against, Mama? I know. I know how they look at me every time I walk into an interview room. I know I have to work twice, 3 times as hard as anyone else. She paused, taking a deep breath to steady herself, then continued. But Mama, if I don't try, who will? Who will break those barriers? If I give up, little girls like me will think they don't have a chance. I can't let that happen. Aisha fell silent, her gaze filled with both surprise and pain as she looked at her daughter. Layla, her voice caught in her throat. I just want you to be safe. Layla looked at her mother, feeling the genuine worry in her words. She knew Aisha only wanted to shield her from heartbreak and failure. But Layla also knew she couldn't abandon her dream. At that moment, the door to the bedroom creaked open, and Gabriel Karim, Layla's younger brother, stepped into the kitchen. I heard everything, Gabriel said, walking closer to the table. Mama, she's doing the right thing. If she doesn't try, who will? We can't wait for someone else to break the barriers for us. Gabriel turned to his mother, his voice firm and persuasive. You always taught us to stand up for what we believe in. So why are you asking Layla to give up now? Aisha sat in silence, unable to find the words to respond. Layla reached out and placed her hand over her brother's, giving it a gentle squeeze, a silent thank you. Gabriel had always believed in her, always stood by her side. Aisha sighed deeply and walked over to the window. Outside, the Bronx bustled as it always did. People rushing by, gray buildings lined up in endless rows. Layla, I'm just scared you'll get hurt. Layla joined her mother by the window, her eyes soft but resolute. Mama, the greatest hurt would be if I gave up on my dream. I can't live my life full of regrets. Aisha turned to face her daughter, studying her for a long moment. Finally, she gave a small nod, though her eyes still carried a hint of sadness. Do you really believe you can do this? Without hesitation, Layla replied, I believe it. And you need to believe in me too. The conversation ended, but Layla knew her journey was far from over. A few days later, as she prepared for her next flight, an unexpected call came through. Layla Karim? A familiar, deep voice resonated through the line. Layla froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Yes, this is she replied. There was a brief pause before the voice continued. I have an opportunity for you. Are you interested? A confident smile spread across Layla's face. Of course. Layla hurried down Jamaica Avenue near JFK Airport. The late spring wind blew cold through the bustling streets, filled with honking cars and hurried footsteps. She pulled her coat tighter around her body and stepped into a small cafe on the corner, a modest place where she was set to meet Jack Barlow, the man she hoped could change her life. The cafe was unremarkable. Worn wooden tables, gray brick walls, and the mingling scents of weak coffee and freshly baked pastries filled the air. But for Layla, this place could define her future. She chose a table by the window, clutching her cup of hot coffee, the steam briefly fogging her glasses. Her fingers tapped lightly on the table as she tried to stay calm, though her mind raced with questions. Will he show up? Am I being reckless by reaching out to him? Jack Barlow was a mystery. All she knew was that he had once been an extraordinary military pilot who had become a tech billionaire, until a family tragedy had driven him to abandon everything, including aviation. Layla knew convincing Jack Barlow wouldn't be easy. The cafe door swung open, and Jack stepped inside. He wore an old, weathered leather jacket, its shoulders worn thin, likely a relic from his days as a military pilot. His posture was slightly hunched, as though burdened by memories he could never quite let go of. Jack's eyes scanned the room before landing on Layla. She lifted her head, her determined gaze meeting his tired one. In that moment, Layla saw past Jack's aloof exterior and weary demeanor to the man who had once dared to dream and fight. Jack approached her table slowly and sat down across from her. What do you want? His voice was raspy and dry, yet not entirely unkind. Layla set her coffee down, straightened her back, and met his gaze head-on. "I need your help," she said plainly. Jack raised an eyebrow. "I'm not in aviation anymore." "You got the wrong guy." Layla shook her head. "You're exactly who I need. You broke barriers to become one of the best pilots in the world. I believe you can help me do the same." Jack studied her carefully, his sharp eyes searching for any sign of insincerity. "Why are you so determined to do this?" he asked, his tone softer but still guarded. Layla took a deep breath, knowing this was her moment to lay it all bare. "Because if I don't try, no one else will," she began. She paused briefly, her voice growing more resolute. "You know this industry as well as I do. People like me, black women, don't get chances. They say we don't belong in the cockpit, but I want to change that. If I don't sit in that seat, no one like me ever will." Jack leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. His gaze drifted out the window to the hurried streets outside. A flicker of inner conflict crossed his face. He understood her words. He had once fought against prejudice himself, but he also knew the price of breaking those barriers. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into," Jack said slowly. "This industry is brutal. It will chew you up and spit you out. And you won't just face the pressure of the job. You'll face a world watching, waiting for you to fail." Layla's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not weak. I'm a black woman who grew up in the Bronx. I've faced pressure my whole life." Jack chuckled softly, though it wasn't mocking. It carried a note of surprise and respect. "You're stubborn, aren't you?" Layla smiled faintly. "Being stubborn is the only reason I've made it this far." After a long pause, Jack leaned forward, his eyes less cold than before. "I've got a flight coming up. Not on a commercial plane, just a small one. If you want, you can come along. But I'm not promising anything." Layla blinked, caught off guard, but quickly composed herself. "That's all I need, a chance," she said. Jack stood, adjusting his jacket. Before leaving, he glanced back at her. "Kid, this could cost you everything." Layla didn't flinch. "I'm ready." Jack studied her for another moment, then gave a curt nod. "Be at the airport tomorrow, 6 a.m. sharp. Don't be late." The cafe door closed behind him, leaving Layla sitting alone, her heart pounding. She knew she had just been handed her last chance. One final glimmer of hope. The next morning, at a small airfield outside New York, Layla met Jack again. The first training flight began, and Layla faced the biggest test of her life. The door to the cockpit was finally opening for her. But would she have the strength to step through? Jack Barlow's old pickup truck rumbled down a dusty dirt road, carrying Layla to a small, unassuming airstrip on the outskirts of Texas. On either side, barren fields stretched endlessly toward the horizon, the dry grass swaying lightly in the southern heat. When the truck came to a halt, Layla stepped out and took in her surroundings. A small silver propeller plane sat waiting on a packed dirt runway. It wasn't sleek or modern, far from the gleaming jets she had once served on, but its rugged simplicity made her heart race. The plane seemed to beckon her toward a new journey. Jack stepped out of the truck, adjusted his worn leather jacket, and gestured toward the plane. "This is our partner," Jack said. "You ready?" Layla nodded firmly. "Yes, I'm ready." Jack smirked. "You'll have to prove it." On the first morning, Layla stepped onto the runway under the blazing sun. Jack was already there, arms crossed, his sharp eyes drilling into her like a commander sizing up a soldier. "Lesson 1, Jack said, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Know your plane inside and out. If you can't take care of it, you'll never be able to fly it." He handed her a checklist and tasked her with inspecting every part of the plane, from the wings and engine to the landing gear. Layla bent down, running her hands over the details. Her fingers trembled slightly as they grazed the control stick in the cockpit. "You're shaking," Jack observed, his tone clipped. "Scared?" Layla gritted her teeth, tightening her grip. "No, just nervous. You'd better get used to it. There's no room for hesitation up there." The days that followed were grueling. Jack pushed her through relentless drills, takeoffs, landings, emergency protocols. Layla quickly realized that flying wasn't just about technical skill. It was a battle of endurance, discipline, and mental fortitude. Jack never offered praise, or encouragement. His feedback was cold and unflinching. Too slow. What are you doing? Trying to kill us? Start over. Despite the sweat soaking through her clothes and the trembling in her hands after each session, Layla returned to the runway every morning, her determination unbroken. One afternoon, during a landing exercise, Layla made a critical mistake. The propeller plane hit the runway at an alarming speed, slamming down with a jarring thud. Instead of a smooth touchdown, it bounced violently, forcing Jack to grab the controls and avert a disaster. When the plane finally came to a halt, Jack shoved open the cockpit door, fury etched into his face. "You think sheer determination is enough?" he barked. "Flying is life or death. If this had happened in the air, we'd be dead." Layla sat frozen in her seat, her hand still clutching the control stick, slick with sweat. Her throat tightened as tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. Without another word, Jack stormed off, leaving her alone in the cockpit. Tears streamed silently down Layla's face, dripping onto the control panel. "I've failed. I'll never make it," she thought, despair creeping into her heart. But then, the image of her mother, Aisha, surfaced in her mind, along with the sting of rejection letters and the weight of doubters' stares. She remembered the dream that had carried her this far, the dream to break barriers no one else dared challenge. Wiping her tears, Layla climbed out of the plane and ran after Jack. "I don't have a choice," she shouted, her voice trembling but resolute. Jack turned slowly, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. "I have to do this," Layla continued, her voice breaking yet firm. "If I don't, no one like me will ever have a chance to sit in that cockpit. I won't give up." Jack stood in silence, studying her intently. In her eyes, he saw a reflection of himself years ago, a younger man fighting against a world that didn't believe in him. After a long pause, Jack gave a faint nod, his expression softening ever so slightly. "All right," he said quietly. "If you're that determined, I'll keep training you. But remember, every mistake comes at a cost." Layla managed a small smile, her tear-streaked face glowing with newfound resolve. "Thank you," she whispered. Jack turned away, his voice dropping low. "Don't thank me. Prove I'm not wasting my time." The training continued. Slowly but surely, Layla began to improve. Her movements grew more confident, her decisions more precise. But the toughest challenge was yet to come. One morning, Jack announced the next step, a real flight under harsh weather conditions. "You think you're ready?" he asked, his steely gaze challenging her. Layla responded without hesitation. "I'm ready." As the small plane roared down the runway and ascended into the sky, Layla knew this wasn't just about mastering flight. This was about fighting for her dream and proving she belonged among the clouds. Layla stood at the gates of the New York Aviation Training Center, her eyes fixed on the imposing building ahead. The gleaming metal sign on the wall read, "New York Aviation Training Center." This time, she didn't feel the nervous flutter that had plagued her during previous steps in her journey. After enduring Jack Barlow's grueling training in Texas, she had grown stronger and more confident than ever. But she also knew today's examination would be her greatest test yet. As she stepped into the examination room, her heels echoed against the polished stone floor. The air was cold, heavy with tension. Behind the desk sat Captain Robert Hale, a man with silver-gray hair cropped neatly and eyes as cold as steel. Known for his strictness and deeply ingrained conservative beliefs, Robert Hale was the embodiment of every obstacle Layla had faced in her journey. He didn't believe women, especially women of color, belonged in the cockpit. Layla entered the room and gave a polite nod. Hale didn't respond in kind. Instead, his eyes swept over her, scrutinizing her from head to toe as if assessing her worth in a single glance. "Layla Karim," he said, his voice low and sharp. "Do you know why you're here today?" Layla held her composure. "To prove I have what it takes to become a pilot." Hale let out a dry chuckle, flipping through the file on his desk. "You think you can be a pilot?" he asked, his tone laced with doubt. "This isn't just about knowing theory. We need people who can handle real pressure." Layla's gaze remained steady. "I've been handling pressure my entire life, sir," she replied calmly, her voice unwavering. "If there's one thing life has taught me, it's to stay calm and make the right decisions." Hale didn't respond immediately. Instead, he rose from his chair and motioned for her to follow him to the flight simulator room. The simulator was a large, immersive space with wraparound screens replicating the cockpit of a commercial airliner. Layla settled into the captain's seat, her hands instinctively gripping the control stick. The familiar feel of the controls reassured her. Jack's rigorous training had prepared her for this moment. "Are you ready?" Hale's voice crackled through the intercom. "Yes," Layla replied, her focus sharp as she scanned the controls. The test began with standard procedures: takeoff and landing under clear weather conditions. Layla executed every maneuver with precision and confidence. But just as the examination neared its conclusion, a sudden emergency alert flashed on the screen. Cabin pressure lost. The shrill sound of alarms filled the simulator. From behind the observation glass, Hale's sharp eyes tracked Layla's every move, searching for signs of panic or hesitation. Layla didn't flinch. Her hands moved swiftly across the controls as she analyzed the situation. Descending to stabilize pressure, she announced, her voice calm and decisive. "Engaging emergency oxygen systems for passengers." Her fingers danced over the console, activating the necessary protocols. The simulated aircraft gradually steadied, the crisis resolved. When the test ended, Layla removed her headset and stood, turning to face Hale through the observation glass. "I'm not just good at theory," she said, her voice firm. "I can handle emergencies, and I can do it when lives are on the line." Hale entered the simulator room, his expression unreadable. There was a flicker of surprise in his eyes, though he quickly masked it. "You handled that well," he said, his tone clipped. "But don't think that's enough. Real pressure is far different." Layla met his gaze without faltering. "Real pressure is something I've faced my entire life," she replied. "I'm used to being underestimated, but that's never stopped me from aiming high." Hale paused, his steely demeanor softening ever so slightly. He studied her in silence, as though re-evaluating everything he had assumed about her. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "All right, Karim, I'll forward your results to the board. You have potential. But remember," Layla waited unblinking, "the skies are no place for the weak." Layla allowed herself a small smile. "I've never thought of myself as weak, sir." Walking out of the training center, the warm sunlight of New York bathed Layla's face. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with unshakable confidence. "I did it. Just one more chance." And she knew, deep down, that her true flight was on the horizon. Layla sat quietly in the waiting room of the flight training center. The small room, with its plain white walls and the steady ticking of a clock on the wall, seemed unbearably still. The cold metal of the chair pressed against her palms, but it was nothing compared to the weight of anticipation gripping her heart. Everything felt frozen in time. The examination was over. Layla clasped her hands tightly, feeling the slight tremble in her fingers. Her gaze drifted into the distance, as if searching for a glimpse of the future she had fought so hard to reach. A future she had pursued with relentless perseverance and unwavering resolve. The room was so quiet, she could hear the rhythm of her own heartbeat. The ticking of the clock filled the air, its steady beat mocking her as each second stretched into an eternity. They're deciding right now. What are they thinking? Did I do enough? Or will I face rejection again? Just like before? Layla took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. But in that moment, memories of her journey came rushing back, unbidden, vivid as if replaying in her mind. Her days as a flight attendant, every passing glance at the cockpit doors igniting her dream, a dream of sitting in the pilot's seat, commanding the skies. The cold, impersonal rejection letters from flight training programs, each one stinging with disappointment, but never breaking her determination. The grueling days in Texas, training with Jack Barlow, where she faced her fears head-on and discovered strength she didn't know she possessed. Layla pressed her lips together, willing away her nerves. She thought to herself, as if giving her own spirit a pep talk, "No matter what happens, I've done everything I could. This dream isn't just mine. It belongs to everyone who's ever been told they couldn't. If today isn't the day, I'll keep going. I won't stop. Her hand drifted to the small pin on her jacket pocket, a symbol of Blue Sky Airlines, the company where her journey first began. This dream was no longer just a distant hope. She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply to push away the anxiety threatening to overwhelm her. In that fleeting second, she allowed herself to imagine. She was in the cockpit, her hands on the controls, lifting the plane effortlessly into the boundless sky. The soft creak of the waiting room door snapped her back to reality, jolting her upright. Robert Hale stepped inside, his gaze as cold and unreadable as ever. Layla stood, her hands instinctively clenching into fists at her sides. This was the moment she had been waiting for her entire life. Layla stood in the small meeting room of Blue Sky Airlines, facing the crisp, formal co-pilot uniform neatly folded on the table. Next to it, a polished metal pilot's insignia gleamed under the fluorescent light, a symbol of the dream she had pursued relentlessly for so many years. A manager smiled warmly as they handed her the uniform. "Congratulations, First Officer Layla Karim." Layla took the insignia in her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. She walked over to the large mirror in the room, straightening the deep blue jacket of her uniform. Carefully, she pinned the insignia to her chest, the metal catching the light. In the reflection, she saw herself anew. Layla thought for a moment. This wasn't just a uniform. It was a testament to every effort, every rejection, every prejudice she had fought to overcome. Her eyes brimmed with tears, but she held them back. Clenching her fists, she lifted her chin high and whispered to herself, "This is just the beginning." The next day, Layla stepped into the crew lounge at JFK Airport. Once, she had entered this room as a flight attendant, but today she walked in as a pilot. Her bag felt lighter, but her steps were steadier than ever. As she passed a group of flight attendants, she felt their eyes on her, surprised, admiring, and curious. Some nodded at her respectfully, a gesture she had rarely received before. Layla's first flight as a co-pilot was a long haul from New York to Los Angeles, an ambitious route filled with responsibility and pressure. Entering the cockpit, she found Captain Robert Hale already seated, meticulously reviewing pre-flight checks. Hale glanced at her briefly, his sharp gaze cold as ever. He offered no greeting. The atmosphere in the cockpit was heavy, almost stifling. Layla maintained her composure. Setting her bag down, she calmly began inspecting the control panel before taking her seat in the co-pilot's chair, the seat she had dreamed of for so long. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, Captain Hale broke it with his characteristically blunt tone. "You performed well in training, but the real sky is a different beast." Layla met his gaze, her voice steady and unshaken. "I understand, Captain, and I'm ready." The massive Boeing 737 began, taxiing to the runway. Hale expertly maneuvered the controls, his movements smooth and precise. Layla watched every detail of his actions, her hands never straying far from her own set of controls, prepared for any task Hale might assign her. As the plane lifted off, ascending into the vast blue sky, Layla felt a wave of exhilaration and liberation wash over her. This wasn't just her first flight as a co-pilot. It was the first step in claiming the skies she had long fought for. When the plane reached cruising altitude, the silence returned. Hale made no effort to ease the tension or exchange pleasantries. But Layla wasn't fazed. She had prepared for this moment for years. Breaking the quiet unexpectedly, Hale spoke. "Why do you think you're doing this?" His tone was calm, yet edged with skepticism. Layla turned to him, her eyes resolute. "I'm doing this for myself, and for everyone who's ever been told they couldn't." Hale studied her for a long moment. His expression softened almost imperceptibly, revealing a flicker of recognition. Perhaps for the first time, he saw in her someone who wasn't just proving her own worth, but carrying a larger mission. With a slight nod, he said nothing more. Layla refocused on the control panel, her thoughts unwavering. "This is my first flight, but there will be many more, and I won't stop." The plane soared toward the horizon, where the vast skies awaited her conquest. The flight from New York to Los Angeles had been uneventful until the plane entered Colorado airspace. The clear blue sky was now consumed by thick, menacing clouds. Lightning streaked through the ominous gloom, and the Boeing 737 shuddered as turbulence rippled through its frame. Layla gripped the controls tightly, her eyes fixed on the instrument panel before her. Then, the shrill blare of an alarm pierced the cockpit. "Engine failure warning," the automated voice system announced. Red warning lights flashed incessantly, and the data on the screens fluctuated erratically. One of the plane's engines had failed, and the cabin was losing pressure. Captain Robert Hale immediately scanned the readings, then turned to Layla, his tone sharp and urgent. "We need to head back to JFK right now. I'm not taking any chances." Layla glanced out the window. The storm was closing in from the east, engulfing the entire route back to New York. She steadied her voice, analyzing the situation calmly. "Captain, turning back now will take us straight into the storm. Doing so would put us at even greater risk." Hale frowned, his voice tense yet commanding. "You think you know better than me? I've logged thousands of hours in the air. I know what's safest." Layla met his gaze with unflinching determination. "Sir, I don't doubt your experience, but if we divert to Denver now, we can land safely before the storm overtakes us." Hale's jaw tightened, his irritation evident. "Denver? That's hundreds of miles away. Are you sure this plane can make it in this condition?" Layla's response was swift and resolute. "We have enough fuel to reach Denver. I'll check the readings. Our priority is to get the passengers to safety, and Denver is our best option." The tension in the cockpit was palpable, a taut string ready to snap. Captain Hale stared at Layla for a long moment, his pride grappling with her logic. He knew she was right, but his ego wrestled with the idea of deferring to a junior officer. Finally, he nodded, his voice low and deliberate. "Fine, divert to Denver. But if anything goes wrong, this is on you." Layla didn't flinch. "I'll take responsibility." With swift, practiced motions, she input the new coordinates, guiding the plane toward Denver International Airport. But the situation worsened. The aircraft shook violently in the turbulent air, and lightning flashed incessantly outside the cockpit windows. In the passenger cabin, panic erupted. "The plane's in trouble. Are we going to crash?" Layla's heart pounded against her ribs, but her voice remained calm and steady as she addressed the passengers through the intercom. "This is First Officer Layla Karim speaking. We are experiencing technical difficulties and have decided to divert to Denver for everyone's safety. Please remain calm and follow the crew's instructions. We will get you to safety." At first, the cries of fear persisted, but gradually, her steady, reassuring tone began to ease the panic. Passengers exchanged anxious glances that softened into faint glimmers of trust. They clutched their armrests, their loved ones, and their faith in the unseen pilot guiding them. A young mother held her child close, whispering, "Everything's going to be okay. They'll get us through this." Layla checked the instruments one last time. The cabin was still depressurizing, but the emergency oxygen supply had been activated for the passengers. Outside, the storm roared, but the plane had managed to skirt its worst fury, thanks to Layla's decisive action. Ahead, the skies over Denver came into view, clear and vast like a promise. The tension began to ebb as the Blue Sky aircraft prepared for its final approach to the international airport. Layla's grip on the controls tightened as the runway grew larger through the cockpit glass. The automated system chimed. "Landing gear deployed. Ready for touchdown. Take us down, First Officer Karim," Captain Hale ordered, his voice steady but softer than before. Layla nodded, her hands firm yet precise as she guided the Boeing 737 down the approach path. "Speed check. Altitude steady." The wheels kissed the tarmac with a smooth, controlled landing. The screech of rubber against the runway echoed briefly before subsiding into silence. A collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin, followed by the eruption of applause. Passengers stood, clapping with fervor. Relief and gratitude filled the air, replacing the earlier terror. A flight attendant stepped into the cockpit, her expression brimming with emotion. "Thank you both. The passengers want to thank you personally." Layla offered a small nod, but kept her focus on Captain Hale, who sat silently, watching her. Hale leaned back in his seat, his gaze on Layla filled with something new. The skepticism and condescension were gone, replaced by quiet respect. "You did well," he said, his voice measured and sincere. Layla met his eyes, her own shining with quiet pride. "I just did what needed to be done, Captain." Hale allowed himself a rare smile, then stood, extending his hand toward her. "I was wrong about you. You're not just a skilled pilot. You're someone who deserves to be here." Layla clasped his hand, her grip firm and confident. She returned his smile with one of her own, though her eyes held a deeper meaning. "This recognition isn't just for me. It's for everyone who's ever been underestimated because of their gender or skin color." Hale seemed to understand. He nodded, a glimmer of admiration in his expression. "The skies are yours, Layla Karim." The intercom crackled to life, announcing, "We have safely landed at Denver International Airport. Thank you for flying with Blue Sky." Layla removed her headset, a wave of relief washing over her. But beyond relief, she felt pride in knowing that a dream had become reality and that she had earned her place in the sky. The headquarters of Blue Sky Airlines, nestled in the heart of Manhattan, shimmered with brilliance on this special evening. In the Grand Hall, hundreds of Blue Sky employees, veteran pilots and fresh-faced flight attendants alike, had gathered. On the stage, the company's logo stood proudly beside the bold words, "Honoring Excellence." The murmurs in the room gradually quieted as the MC stepped onto the stage. All eyes turned to a single name, the one person everyone knew would be celebrated tonight. With a warm, resonant voice filled with pride, the MC began. "Tonight, we honor someone who has broken barriers and become an inspiration to us all. Please welcome First Officer Layla Karim." Layla ascended the stage, her dark blue co-pilot uniform fitting her petite yet resolute frame perfectly. Each of her steps echoed through the silent hall, and when she reached the microphone, her eyes swept over the audience. Familiar faces stared back at her, some who had doubted her, others who had advised her to give up. Yet now, they all sat there listening, watching, their gazes filled with admiration. Layla clasped her hands tightly for a brief moment, then drew a deep breath before beginning her speech. Layla stood on the grand stage of Blue Sky Airlines Hall, bathed in the glow of the bright stage lights. The beams reflected off the gleaming co-pilot insignia pinned to her crisp uniform. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly, yet her gaze remained calm and resolute. In the audience, hundreds of eyes were fixed on her, seasoned pilots, company executives, and young flight attendants alike. Among them were those who had doubted her, who had said she didn't belong. But tonight, they were here to listen. Layla stepped forward to the microphone, her voice clear, yet laden with emotion as it filled the room. "Years ago, when I first entered the aviation industry, I believed the sky had its limits." She paused, her eyes sweeping over the audience. "But I came to realize those limits weren't set by the sky. They were created by people." The room was silent, every ear hanging on her words. There were those who told me I didn't belong in the cockpit, that there was no place for someone like me here. But I refused to accept that, because I believe dreams have no boundaries. She lifted her chin, her voice gaining strength. "The sky doesn't discriminate against color, gender, or background. We can all soar if we dare to dream and are willing to fight for it." Layla's gaze settled on the young flight attendants in the front row, her voice softening, yet carrying an undeniable power. "And today, I want to say something to every little girl looking up at the sky. Those who've been told they're not good enough, not strong enough, not smart enough to achieve what they dream of. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you can't. If I can do it, so can you." Applause erupted like thunder. People rose from their seats, clapping relentlessly. The young flight attendants were the first to stand, their eyes shining with admiration and pride. To them, Layla wasn't just a pilot. She was a symbol of hope and change. Layla allowed herself a small, heartfelt smile, taking a steadying breath as emotions surged within her. At the very back of the hall, a man sat quietly, observing the ceremony. Jack Barlow. His suit was plain, understated, devoid of pomp or pretension. His eyes, however, gleamed with quiet pride as he watched Layla, his former student, now standing radiant on the stage. Jack didn't need to say a word. Every compliment, every acknowledgement was etched in his gaze. When Layla's eyes scanned the room, they found Jack seated at the back. Her expression faltered for a brief moment, surprise flickering in her eyes. But then, it softened into a look of profound gratitude. Layla gave a subtle nod in Jack's direction, as if to say, "Thank you." Jack offered a faint smile, bowing his head in return. He murmured, his voice low but carrying an unshakable conviction, as if it could reach her across the distance. "You did it. I always knew you could." Layla's eyes glistened with emotion as she looked back at Jack. In that moment, no further words were needed. They both understood that this journey wasn't just hers. It was the journey of those who dared to break barriers and reach for the skies. JFK Airport, New York. It was a crisp, clear morning. The golden sunlight gleamed off Blue Sky's brand new jet, standing tall and proud on the expansive runway. The engines hummed steadily, a low, rhythmic murmur, as if eager for the journey ahead. Layla Karim strode across the tarmac, her small frame exuding quiet strength with every step. Her dark blue co-pilot uniform hugged her form, a perfect fit for someone radiating confidence and determination. The pilot's insignia on her chest shimmered under the morning sun. She paused at the foot of the staircase leading up to the plane, lifting her gaze to the endless blue sky above. "I've made it," she thought to herself. "I'm here." With steady strides, Layla ascended the steps, the sound of her footsteps echoing like the rhythm of pride and resolve. At the top, she reached for the cockpit door, her hand lingering for a moment before she pushed it open. Inside, the cockpit awaited her, pristine, orderly, and filled with sleek, modern controls. Layla settled into the co-pilot's seat on the right. Her hands brushed lightly over the instrument panel, the blinking lights seeming to beckon her forward, like beacons guiding her dreams. Her fingers found the throttle, the smooth grip connecting her to the immense power of the aircraft. She let the sensation sink in, a quiet realization blooming in her chest. "This isn't a dream anymore," she thought. "This is real." Captain Robert Hale entered the cockpit, taking his place in the captain's seat to her left. He glanced at Layla from the corner of his eye and gave her a small nod. The once cool distance in his gaze had melted away, replaced with something warmer, respect. "Are you ready, First Officer Karim?" Hale asked, his voice deep but softer now. Layla smiled, her eyes alight with resolve. "I'm ready, Captain." The jet began to taxi down the runway. The engines roared to life, their power surging like a pulse. The aircraft picked up speed, the wheels screeching against the tarmac as it accelerated. Layla gripped the controls firmly, her focus unbroken as she kept her eyes locked on the sky ahead. The plane barreled down the runway, then lifted off with force and grace, soaring upward into the boundless blue. Layla Karim was flying high, unbound by limits, untouched by doubt. Above, the azure sky stretched endlessly, a canvas of infinite possibility. The plane ascended with a proud, triumphant roar, its wings cutting through the air with unwavering confidence. Layla's journey continued, a journey without boundaries, a testament to those who dared to dream and fought to make those dreams real. Did Layla truly conquer the skies? Don't miss out on more inspiring stories. Comment, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next chapter.